The Juneau World Affairs Council presents 3 Minutes Over Germany, Smilin Thru, with Tony Yorba. Yorba recently traveled to Germany and retraced the final fateful minutes of his father's World War II B17 mission over the Bavarian industrial city Schweinfurt. The bomber was named Smilin Thru.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Smilin Thru is an essential American response to adversity. The adversity we as a nation faced in the dark, early days of World War II must have seemed insurmountable. The ability to smile through adversity, to believe that in the end there would be a homecoming, a return to a peaceful home, helped many to persevere despite a world in flames. This was my parents' experience, an experience shared with countless others. And it's a righteous thing to honor that perseverance, that ability to keep smiling through so that we learn from it and apply it to our own experience. A couple years ago, I received an email from a German researcher asking me if I knew anything about a B-17 or its crew that crashed on October 14, 1943, near his home village of Sennfeld, Germany during World War II. He shared information concerning that day that I thought had disappeared long ago, and I knew that he had to be talking about my father's plane and its 10-man crew. While our family has always been very proud of my father's service in World War II, none of us ever really knew the details of what happened when his airplane was lost 3 minutes after bombs away during the famous mission to the ball bearing factories of Schweinfurt, deep in central Germany. Even my father was unsure. He knew that some of his crew didn't make it out of the aircraft, but he never knew why. Researcher and author Norbert Wollmann has pieced together the evidence that explains those 3 minutes. Since that email exchange, he and his wife Marianne have become family friends. They visited Juneau, bringing with them a piece of my father's B-17, a relic that we presented to my mother, who remembers those days like they were yesterday. At Norbert's suggestion, this last September, my wife and I traveled to the area where the crash occurred to witness the evidence and to speak with people who still carry that event with them. It occurred over 70 years ago, but as you will see, it resonates even today. However, before we go to the Germany of today, I think it's important to place that time in context. So I'd like to first tell you the story leading up to Schweinfurt, how a young couple's lives were changed, and how a young rancher's son found himself in command of a 10-man bomber, his time as a prisoner of war, and his repatriation. That background makes those final 3 minutes all the more remarkable. America changed on December 7, 1941. Bernardo Yorba, son of a Spanish-speaking California ranchero, responded to Pearl Harbor like millions of other Americans. He dropped out of Loyola University in Los Angeles, and shortly after his 21st birthday, on March 27, 1942, volunteered to join the Army Air Corps with hope of becoming a flyer. The first step on the road to becoming a military pilot was 9 weeks of ground school at Santa Ana Army Air Base on what is now the Orange County Fairgrounds in Southern California. In 1942, the base was less than an hour drive from the Yorba family citrus ranch. The base was originally planned for 3,000 recruits, and the 1941 master plan called for 145 buildings, virtually a new city, in what was at that time string bean fields. And due to the wartime urgency, the base, which did not include an airfield, was built in less than 120 days. But it was operating at even beyond capacity before then, full of raw recruits being taught the basics of military life, with staff evaluating them at each step for their potential as pilots, navigators, or bombardiers. Meanwhile, Yorba's high school sweetheart Margie, then 19, quit Woodbury Business College and her dream of going to Hollywood. She got a job at the base working for Captain Myers, processing recruits' paperwork. One of her jobs was to assign the new cadets their Army ID number. She selected one for Bernardo, 74-1000. She thought that was an easy number to remember. The recruits were restricted to the base, except for an occasional weekend. On his weekend off, Ben was feted to a traditional barbecue on a remote corner of the Yorba Ranch. There, amid the terraces of eucalyptus trees and citrus groves bordered by rolling, grassy-covered hills, the clouds of war were hard to see. The couple planned a date for the next day, including a drive to nearby Los Angeles. Margie dreamed that night she would be given a tiny heart-shaped ring. The next day, while driving to LA, Bernardo pulled off the road into a huge field of flowers, zinnias. And in the middle of it, he proposed with a large diamond ring. Well, large for a recruit making $31.50 a month. The ring he paid for with money won playing craps in the barracks. And he bought it at discount from a barracks buddy's family jewelry store. After Santa Ana, Yorba's primary flight training began about 100 miles up the coast at Mira Loma Flight Academy in Oxnard. Mira Loma was one of a number of privately run training facilities contracted by the military to create the pilots that were needed to man the thousands of planes then being built. The new cadets learned to fly Stearman PT-17s, rumored to be so easy they flew themselves. The Stearman were tandem seat biplanes, allowing the flying instructor to accompany the fledgling pilot at all times. Yorba was more accustomed to riding horses than flying, and it was a struggle, but he completed the program with his class and earned graduation rights. Graduation from Mira Loma meant a drive further up the California coast to Gardner Field at Taft, California, and the start of basic training in the Volt-T Valiant. The Valiant, nicknamed the Vibrator due to its rough handling, was purposely designed to be more challenging than primary trainers, but it had a nasty habit of wheeling over and stalling if it was driven at too low a speed on final approach. A stall at low altitude resulted in a nosedive first into the hard-baked San Joaquin Valley clay. There was at least one fatality in Yorba's class, one of over 15,000 aircrew training fatalities that occurred during World War II. After passing basic training, Yorba headed to Roswell, New Mexico for advanced training, flying multi-engined aircraft, odd birds like the Curtiss AT-9 and the Cessna AT-17. These twin-engine aircraft were even more challenging than the previous trainers. They were called transition aircraft, intended to teach the advanced skills required of a bomber pilot. And there were few aerobatics taught at Roswell. They were mostly flat-level flying with sweeping turns, the kind of flying that's required in large formations of bombers. The cadets eventually flew B-25 Mitchell bombers, the fast, agile twin-engine bombers made famous in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942. Yorba loved flying the Mitchell, but the Air Corps needed crews for its growing four-engine bomber groups, and he never flew one again after Roswell. 4 hours after graduating advanced training, on March 10, 1943, Bernardo married Margie, his high school sweetheart, in a ceremony at the base chapel. The union was frowned upon by the families. They worried about the differences of religion and the difficult life of a potential war widow, and they pleaded against it, but the couple had other plans. After graduation, Bernardo and the rest of the cadets were ordered to take a troop train to Salt Lake City for their next assignment. Margie accompanied Bernardo, boarding the troop train amid a shower of rice thrown by other cadets and the sympathetic non-intervention by the porters. The train must have just come out of mothballs. It was musty and dirty, everything was covered in soot, and it was pulled by an antique coal-burning locomotive. Bernardo and Margie spent their honeymoon on a top bunk in a crowded car shared with all the other cadets. The old locomotive took 4 days to pull the train to Salt Lake, but for Margie, now a 20-year-old girl on her own for the first time, it was an adventure of a lifetime. At Salt Lake City, Yorba was given the commission as a second lieutenant, an assignment to Pyote, Texas, and the keys to a B-17 Flying Fortress, America's hope for delivering the war to Nazi Germany. The B-17 was a remarkable engineering feat. Originally flown in 1935, the Flying Fortress was a heavily armed, robustly built aircraft capable of absorbing incredible damage and delivering enormous firepower from 13 machine guns firing half-inch diameter shells. And this at a time when the standard British bomber was using rifle-grade .30 caliber weapons. The 8th Air Corps believed that the fort had sufficient defensive firepower to defend itself from German fighters and to allow tactical bombing of German infrastructure, factories critical to the war effort, transportation hubs, and harbors, all done in daylight. In fact, all U.S. bomber training efforts were predicated on this theory, that precise daylight bombing was possible without air superiority or protective fighter escorts. Over the next 6 months, Margie accompanied her new husband on his assignments to Pyote, where he first learned to fly the B-17, and later Dalhart, Texas, where he was assigned an aircraft of his own, a B-17F, and a crew. Over those final months of training, the crew of strangers, led by their 21-year-old skipper, learned the art and science of operating a massive 4-engine bomber. They were judged combat ready in order to deploy to the 8th Air Corps' 381st Bomb Group in England. Replacement crews there were urgently needed. 110 B-17s with 1,100 air crew were lost that month there alone. Margie, now 3 months pregnant, said sad goodbyes to Bernardo and returned to California, where she lived with her mother, father, and 2 sisters while waiting for her husband to return. Before leaving, Bernardo named his bomber Smilin Thru, after a contemporary song by British singer Vera Lynn. The middle verse of the song includes this: "When those clouds brought their tears, those 2 eyes of blue kept smiling through at me." Yorba and his crew, relying on the skill of their newly minted navigator, Marty Dahl, also 21, made the hazardous Atlantic crossing via the Great Circle route from Bangor, Maine to Labrador on the extreme northeast corner of North America to the Air Corps' secret airfield, Blue West 1, at the head of a fjord in Greenland, and then on to Meeks Field in Iceland, and finally on to Prestwick, Scotland. It was an astounding feat of navigation for crews who were civilians less than a year earlier. The cold North Atlantic and the ice of Greenland and Iceland still hold hundreds of aircraft and their crews who, lost and disoriented, never completed the trip. Today, there is a memorial at New York's Battery Park bearing the names of 4,600 servicemen and women who did not survive that crossing. Yorba commemorated his crossing with a short snorter, a tradition started by Alaskan bush pilots. His consisted of a U.S. 1942 silver note and an Icelandic kroner, signed by his fellow flyers. Forever after, the bearer must display that short snorter upon meeting past signers. Penalty for failure to produce the short snorter? A round of drinks. Yorba went on from Prestwick to Ridgewell Air Station in Essex, England. It was from such airfields in eastern England that the 8th Air Corps was implementing its daylight bomber campaign. British Bomber Command was more than skeptical of the American plan. They considered it a form of suicide. Their bombers had already been shown to be effective once they converted to night bombing. However, night bombing was indiscriminate. Areas had to be bombed, not targets. Thus, in the British plan, homes were bombed as much as military installations, one of the tragedies that had been occurring in Europe since the war began in 1939. The British had evolved a special bomber for night action, and though they stood no chance against the German fighters by day, They challenged German air supremacy at night in 1943. You see, at that time, Germany controlled virtually all of Europe, as they had since the evacuation of Dunkirk. They were largely unchallenged in Scandinavia to the north, and were fighting horrific land battles in Russia to the east and south in the Mediterranean regions. In occupied France and the Low Countries to the west, however, there was no land war. D-Day was still months and months away. The war in Western Europe at that time was fought entirely in the air. Into that air stepped the American 8th Air Corps in June of 1942. The first missions were over the coastal areas where German air defenses were less aggressive. And some of those early missions went reasonably smoothly, and it appeared perhaps that the daylight bombing campaign was vindicated. Certain early successes, like the devastating bombing of Hamburg Harbor, alarmed the German command. In response, numerous frontline fighter groups were withdrawn from the Russian front to counter the new bomber threat and to reassert their air superiority in the west. As a result, the unescorted bombers suddenly met overwhelming resistance from the German fighters. By the time the Yorba crew arrived in Ridgewell in September of 1943, Bomber Command was critically short of crews. The daylight missions were regularly incurring 10% losses and more. In 1 week, in October 1943, nearly 150 U.S. bombers with 1,500 crew were lost, including 60 planes and 600 crew on October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid. Schweinfurt was the Yorba crew's 6th mission. They made it to the target, the ball-bearing factories on the Main River, but were badly damaged by anti-aircraft fire. And 3 minutes after bombs away, the war was over for them. 4 crewmen were killed when the plane went down. 5 were captured and taken to Stalag Luft 1 on the German Baltic coast. Yorba was taken to Stalag Luft 3, a prison camp in what is now Sagan, Poland. After capture, Yorba was taken to the Stalag Luft, a prisoner of war processing and interrogating center in Frankfurt. The Germans used the interrogation process to size up their captives. Prisoners who they sensed were vulnerable were called out. Some of them were treated harshly, and some were given special treatment and favors, hoping to extract useful information. The rest, however, were sent on to prison camp. Yorba confided the following story sometime later to one of his daughters. Just before capture, he was filling his pockets with millet seed stolen from a barn so that he might have something to eat later on. After capture, he was taken before an interrogator, a high-ranking German officer at the Stalag. The imperious officer, in a grand office with shiny marble floors and opulent furnishings, was doing his best to intimidate the young American. Yorba, standing there with his hands in his pockets and fiddling with the millet seed, was only giving name, rank, and serial number. Irritated and impatient, the officer demanded that he stand at attention and remove his hands from his pockets. With a passive-aggressive smile, Yorba slowly pulled his hands from his pockets, spilling millet seed all over the shiny marble floor. The German interrogator stared at him, red-faced and furious, but he said no more and sent him on his way. Stalag Lift 3 was operated by non-flying Luftwaffe personnel, men either too old or disabled earlier in the war to make them usable for frontline duty. The camp held British and American flying officers. All of them had been downed, captured, and confined. They also were graduates of some of the most rigorous training and technical education then available, placing thousands of extremely intelligent, motivated men with a broad range of skills into a small space with nothing to do resulted in the predictable, frequent escape attempts. Yorba, like many POWs, took part in the escape preparations. He tied the pajamas he wore under his pants at the ankle, and he filled the legs with sand dug from the tunnels, which he then discreetly spread around camp to conceal the digging. The suspicious Germans split the Americans and British officers into separate camps before the tunnels were completed. The British completed the tunnels themselves and used them in what was later called the Great Escape. Yorba was at Mass in the makeshift camp chapel on June 6, 1944. Before Mass began, the little old French priest walked down the aisle, bent over, whispering to the men, and he appeared to be giving them a blessing. The words he was whispering, D-Day, D-Day. It was the POW's first notification that the invasion of Europe had begun. Yorba knew that a lot of men would die that day, but that the end was beginning. And all these years later, that story still brings Margie to tears. Yorba remained in Sagan until January 1945, when nearly 11,000 POWs were forced to move to Stalag 7 in Moosburg, Bavaria, a distance of some 530 kilometers, to ensure Hitler of their availability as negotiating pieces at the end of the war. Starving, poorly equipped, on foot, and in cattle cars, in blizzard conditions that reached a minus 13 degrees, many died. Yorba carried his few possessions in a bag made from the legs of his pajamas, the very same pajamas that served in the tunnel excavation. It was amid this march and struggle to survive that one of the oddest propaganda efforts of the war occurred. German SS soldiers handed out flyers to the POWs shuffling through the snow, proposing that the POWs join the Germans in their fight against the greater evil, the Bolshevik menace from the East, Russia. There is no record of any takers of the German offer. More sinister, however, was the fact that in March 1945, Hitler ordered all prisoners of war to be shot. In a move that jeopardized their own lives, the German army refused to carry out that order. Yorba and the others were liberated by Patton's Third Army in April 1945. In a letter written to his father, Yorba wrote of the impression made on the POWs by General Patton in his twin pearl-handled revolvers. Soon afterwards, Yorba and many other liberated POWs were shipped across the Atlantic aboard the SS Lejeune, a converted German passenger ship. They landed in New York and went on by train and plane to their families across the United States. In Ben Yorba's case, it was to see his bride again and the 18-month-old daughter that he had never seen. After months of deprivation, it must have seemed like a dream. For over 70 years, the story of the Yorba crew was a proud piece of family lore, but about which Bernardo seldom spoke. After returning to the family ranch and a full life that included 10 children, 26 grandchildren, and 36 great-grandchildren, Ben Yorba died one night, lying next to the bride. Lying next to the bride that shared his top bunk on their honeymoon. The second Schweinfurt mission and the lives it changed on October 14, 1943, seemed to be a thing of the past until Norbert Wollmann breathed new life into their story. Through his research, along with that of his research partner Douglas Dashwood Howard and investigator George Schulz, the 3 minutes over Schweinfurt can now be told. So, the following is that part of the story, told not only from the documented history that we found, but also physical evidence shown to my wife Lori and I when we visited the area and the adjacent villages this past September. About 2 p.m., October 14th, 1943, In that first minute after bombs away, Yorba and his crew tried to turn for home. But even before they emerged from the Schweinfurt flak zone, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, Robert Meyer Errand, one of the pilots recently withdrawn from the Russian front, attacked the struggling plane despite the flak. Navigator George O'Sullivan, aboard the bomber Martha II that was next to the Yorba crew, later reported, "I saw a part of an elevator blown off and the number 3 engine on fire. The ship pulled out of formation in a straight and level course. I saw one man bail out, but due to the attacking fighters, I wasn't able to observe anything more." That entire crew went missing in action, and that brief statement was all the families were told until a month later, when Margie learned that Bernardo was a prisoner of war, along with a few other of the crew. In a report filed after the war, Wilbur Roberson, the Yorba crew bombardier, stated, "It was about an hour out from our objective when we were intercepted by German fighters of overwhelming strength, estimated to be 700 and 1,100. They continued their attacks until we reached the flak over Schweinfurt. A burst of flak knocked out one of our engines, setting it on fire and wounding myself and 2 others. However, we got our bombs away onto the target, but soon afterwards, one of our remaining engines ran away and we were left with only 2. Unable to keep up with the formation on 2 engines, we were soon left behind. Fighters attacked en masse, and the tail was riddled, depriving us of elevator control. In an uncontrollable dive, with the left wing on fire, we could do nothing but abandon ship. The pilot, Lieutenant B.M. Yorba, reported the ship blowing up a few seconds after his exit." Still under fighter attack, the pilot gave the order to prepare to abandon ship. Over the village of Senfeld, he sent Flight Engineer Gorgoni from his position in the forward area of the plane to the rear to make sure that the men there, the tail gunner, waist gunner, and ball turret gunner, all got the message. His route forced him to walk a narrow 6-inch wide catwalk over the open bomb bay. While traversing it, Gorgoni either slipped or was hit by enemy fire and fell through the bomb bay, never opening his parachute. Over the farmlands between Senfeld and Hausen, the next village to the east, the pilot again called abandoned ship, and the men in the front of the airplane bailed out the nose, while radio operator Gracie left out the bomb bay, and tail gunner Johnson from the rear hatch. The plane continued to descend. It broke apart and crashed in some woods just beyond Hausen. Luftwaffe fighter pilot Robert Meyer Errand was given partial credit with the victory. Errand was later killed in action over France in May 1944 and was buried nearby. Norbert first took us to the town of Senfeld. The second Burgermeister there met us and was eager to join our little walk through town. October 14th, 1943 was an important event in the village, a way for the village to understand that horrible conflict in human terms. We walked a quiet residential lane to a house on 5 Schweisserstrassen Street. Sergeant Gorgoni, falling from the plane, landed on the roof of a barn here and rolled to the courtyard below. The barn belonged to a pregnant mother of 4, the widow of a German soldier killed on the Eastern Front. Arno Remdi, the child of that pregnant widow, still lives there. He knows the story of the American flyer. He said his mother repaired the roof damaged by Gorgoni's fall from a loan that she paid many years with her small widow's pension. I thanked Arno for sharing his story. He said he understood, and with reddened eyes, reminded us that he had lost his father in that war too. As we completed our visit in town, the second Burgermeister approached me and offered his sincere apologies for what happened 70 years ago. We shook hands, and I thanked him, and I said that we were humbled that they honored these memories so deeply. Gorgoni was buried in the cemetery in Senfeld. The incident was reported to the local authorities and his death duly recorded. Gorgoni apparently didn't have dog tags on his body, but his name appeared on a clothing article. He was given a Catholic burial in the town cemetery. The Burgermeister at the time, a National Socialist, was not so altruistic. He applied for compensation from the central authorities for the cost of the burial. No mention in the record is made if he was successful. The locals remembered the Burgermeister with some scorn. They recall that the village church was damaged during the war, and he requisitioned the valuable tiles salvaged from the church for his own home. No headstone remains. The space where Gorgoni was laid to rest is vacant. After the war, his body was exhumed and moved by the American military. Next, we drove a little ways out of town to the surrounding flat farmland, to the base of a low hill and the edge of a woods named the Lejeune. Nearby is an attractive old stone building, the Bad Senfeld Mill. During the war, a contingent of German soldiers and officers were stationed there. In that second minute after bombs away, the parachutes of the crew would have drifted into this area of the Lejeune and the Bad Senfeld Mill. In October, the harvest was on, and on that clear sunny day, the numerous field workers would have seen the white parachutes in the sky, one drifting into the fields and the others into the woods nearby. Franziska Wiesenberger was a 16-year-old farmer's daughter in nearby Hausen in October 1943. In her late 80s now, she recently recalled, "I observed several shining airplanes in the clear blue sky coming from the direction of Schweinfurt. I saw numerous small puffs of smoke near the planes, which were the exploding flak defense firings. One of the planes near the rear of the formation was hit and exploded. Wreck pieces flew everywhere, and I stepped into the entrance of the cellar and watched the scenario. Amongst the wreckage, I saw two soldiers coming down slowly on parachutes. One landed near Ottohausen, about 3 miles up the valley, and the other one near Senfeld. My father told me that he waited some seconds after jumping from the airplane before opening his parachute, because many men were killed colliding with their own planes. He landed in a field, hid in a barn, then later in the brush along a creek where he was found by a German officer and taken at gunpoint. He said the German officer took note of his officer's insignia and treated him with respect. That included taking him to the officer's house, protecting him from local angry locals, and giving him some tea and toast while waiting for those responsible for processing prisoners of war. The spring at Bad Senfeld produces a sizable rush of water that today flows to an oxbow in the nearby Main River. It's lined with brush and small trees, and flowing between the fields, it would afford the only available hiding place. It didn't take much imagination for us to visualize a series of parachutes drifting down from the sky from the direction of Schweinfurt to the west. The first chutes would have landed in the Lejeune, the last would have overshot the woods and landed in the fields before us. We were looking at the creek where Yorba hid, where he was captured, and the army quarters, the Bad Senfeld Mill, easily mistaken for a house where he was held for removal for processing as a prisoner of war. In the third minute after bombs away, most of the crew had already abandoned the mortally damaged airplane. Radio man Gracie later reported that Boylan was moved from the ball turret to the relative safety of the radio room. In the debriefing report, he saw Boylan, Hewitt, and Feller together as he bailed out. Yorba believed everyone had already abandoned the plane, which was said to explode and break apart a few seconds after he jumped. The following is conjecture, because no one but God really knows those final seconds for sure. But we do know this. The ball turret was hit and disabled. Boylan, stunned or wounded, is unable to make the difficult maneuver to dismount the steel cylinder. Hewitt and Feller help him out and move him forward to the radio compartment. They tried to get him into his parachute, but while doing so, the aircraft breaks up and falls away below them. Pinned by G-forces to the side of the aircraft, All three remain immobilized in the heaving airplane as it makes its final gasp. Perhaps they remained despite the order to abandon ship. Maybe they didn't realize the danger until it was too late. But radio man Gracie made eye contact with them before he jumped, and they had practiced this final maneuver time and time again in the past. Their lives depended on quickly executing that plan, so they had to know. Waist gunner Michael Feller was an idealist. He had lived in a Zionist community in Palestine as a youth, son of a Jewish activist, and worked for labor causes when they returned to the States. In 1937, he returned to Europe, joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, and fought with the Republicans against the fascists during the Spanish Civil War. There, he served first as an artilleryman and later with an anti-tank unit. After Spain, Feller returned to college in New York, only to again volunteer to fight the fascists, this time as an American air crewman. Feller was a seasoned warrior with years of combat experience. He could have jumped. He knew the risks. I believe he and Hewitt stayed in the aircraft, trying to help Boylan get into his parachute, either not knowing or not caring that their plane was doomed. They died heroes, trying with their last ounce to aid a comrade. Norbert next took us to the small village of Hausen. There, we met the third Burgermeister, some interested historians, and a lovely local couple, Roland and his wife Rita, who was herself a local historian. Rita's mother was living in Hausen on October 14, 1943, and filed a report to the local authorities at the time, which stated, "For some reason, the air raid warnings didn't go off in Hausen that day, but we were aware that something was happening in Schweinfurt, some kilometers away. We were on edge, not sure if we should take cover indoors. We saw a B-17 descending, lower and lower, and then saw it begin to shed pieces, so we ran indoors to take cover." She didn't say whether the aircraft was followed by a fighter, but at approximately 200 feet, just past her family home on the edge of town, the aircraft broke up in midair. The largest section, the aft third of the fuselage and tail, continued until it pancaked into the south side of a small little valley uphill from town. In it were the bodies of Hewitt, Feller, and Boylan. Rita says that her mother was not permitted to go to see the crash site. Her parents shielded her from the awful scene. But 14-year-old Alphonse Stuhler was not so shy. He entered the shattered plane and grabbed a radio, forever endearing himself to his family as the radio thief. The story of the Alphonse radio caper is still told to his descendants to this day in Hausen. Monica Schempf recovered the parachutes hidden by the crew. They were used to make clothing. Hausen had no strategic value. There were no Jewish families there, so the agony of the Holocaust was not experienced firsthand. Yet the troubles were apparent. Rita's mother recalled how the local Hitler youth would perform some kind of exercises on Sunday mornings, the same time that Mass was held. She was ridiculed by some of her neighbors for going to Mass instead of staying out and supporting the youth. You see, even in a small town, it was a bad time. Yet that crash at 2:42 on October 14, 1943, was the most significant event of the war to that date, and it still conjures strong feelings. Rita and her husband Roland accompanied our group on our walk up the grassy draw to where the plane came to rest. Most large pieces were removed long ago, recycled for Germany's own war effort. Subsequent construction covered a portion of the crash area. But the rear fuselage section came to rest higher up in the woods and has remained undisturbed since 1943. Some of us ventured into the area as if entering a temple. Investigator George Schultz assembled his metal detector and immediately began finding empty .50 caliber machine gun shells, evidence of the crew's furious running gun battle with the Luftwaffe across the skies of France and Germany. George found black-tipped tracers and color-corded armor-piercing slugs. We found pieces of aluminum aircraft skin, complete with rivets, and the gray paint typical of the underside of a 1943 B-17. We found a hinged cap that covered some electrical connection point. We had found the final resting place of the aircraft. Despite the sunny, warm day, in a peaceful modern Germany, I suddenly felt cold and alone. I walked in silence by myself, thinking of those souls who were not lost, but whose bodies died on that hillside, and the lives of those who were affected by the events of the war. I was moved to recite one of my favorite prayers, which ends, "Hail Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death." Roland approached me on that lonely wooden hillside and asked me what I was thinking, but I know he was thinking the same things. We collected a few items found on this hillside where the final 3 minutes of Black Thursday played out for Ben Yorba and his crew. The items are relics to be distributed to the families of the crew. Otherwise, in silence, we left that place as it had lain since 1943. We got in our cars and drove without speaking back to Hausen, to the cemetery located in a quiet area behind the church there. At the rear of the cemetery, there remains an open area where Feller, Hewitt, and Boylan were laid to rest together, the burial conducted by the village minister. I stood at the plot in confused, silent prayer. Suddenly, I had forgotten the Lord's Prayer, the familiar words just rolling around in my mind like empty shell casings against a cold fuselage. However, reading my mind, Roland asked that we say a prayer, and the group said the Lord's Prayer in German. And in that silence afterwards, there was peace. After the war, Boylan, Hewitt, and Feller, along with Gorgoni, were moved to the Lorraine Military Cemetery in France. In 1998, barely a month after Ben Yorba's passing, a remembrance monument to the Second Schweinfurt mission was erected in a joint effort by the Second Schweinfurt Memorial Association and the Memorial Association of German Flak Gunners. Each of us there had been affected by the war, but obviously some much more than I. Yet a kinship bloomed due to a shared, life-changing event that occurred over 3 minutes on October 14th, 1943. I was thanked by several present for the sacrifice of our fathers, and heartfelt apologies were made to me to be shared with my mother and others hurt by the war. But for me, I saw the evidence of a righteous effort to remember the past, to honor it, and keep it alive so that its lessons are not forgotten. We need to know that and to honor that effort of remembrance and to practice it ourselves. We need to keep smiling through. Thanks. It's a big, never-ending story. We'll continue the research. The thing that I think that's missing is the fact that from the German side, the sacrifices were huge, and in fact, the German Luftwaffe pilot that was credited, partial credit with shooting my father down, was like virtually my dad's age and has much the same background and experience as my father. And it's an interesting story. His son is interested in sharing that story, and through an intermediary, looking forward to working with them. Also, we're looking forward to getting more of the stories of the villagers in Hausen, maybe a town of 140 people. This was the biggest thing of the war to them. And many people there, either they remember it or the experiences are handed down family to family. So happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions. There's a microphone back here, and otherwise, thank you. No questions? Well, how did my mom get in that troop train? Yes. That's a pretty funny story. Yeah, yeah. She's My mother is responsible for much of the anecdotal information in here. She's 94 and has a better memory than I have. So she's been a huge resource for this. Yes?
Hi, Tony. I don't really have a question. I just had, well, it's kind of a question, more of a comment. I don't know if you knew this, but last year there was a young exchange student from Germany, and she was from Hausen. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah.
No, I totally didn't know that.
Selena was her name, and she lived with John and Terry, John Parent and Terry Rasmussen for the year. So I thought that was really interesting because I actually was an exchange student in Würzburg, which is just you know, a couple of towns away from Schweinfurt. And I'm not sure if you're aware of what happened in Würzburg about a year after the period that you're talking about, but Würzburg was just bombed to 80% destroyed.
Leveled, yeah.
Leveled, just completely leveled. And they celebrate that, well, they don't celebrate, they memorialize that on, it's March 16th, it's actually 1945, so it was about a year and a half after that. But it's interesting because in Würzburg, they still talk about it. It's still quite an impact on that community. And my host parents still remember it, actually, you know, when they went down into the cellars and were waiting, and they talk about the period after it. What's interesting about it is that they still aren't sure why Würzburg was bombed, because it had no military value at all. Right. And at least my host parents talked about that the sort of the running theory is that they were still trying to bomb the Kugellagerfabriken, the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt.
And they still didn't get it right.
And they still didn't get it right because it was the British that bombed it.
Right.
So they were doing a night bombing, and they still, you know, so it's kind of a mystery why, you know, Würzburg was bombed. It was bombed more than Dresden. It was actually wiped out more than Dresden was at the time. And it's a beautiful town. I don't know if you got a chance to go through it.
Yeah,
But.
actually, we went to Würzburg before I met Norbert, and it was really funny because here the year before we met Norbert, we had been there like, I don't know, 20 miles from his house.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a small world.
Yeah, that whole area is very interesting. I thought you just might like to know that that there was somebody from Hausen, and I wasn't actually aware or sure of where Hausen was, but as she talked about it, you know, the towns around it, Schweinfurt and Würzburg, she was very familiar with all those towns that I was familiar with, but I've never been to Hausen. But
yeah, the quality of life is remarkable. It's a beautiful village. I'm like, well, Germany is just full of wonderful villages. You know, perfect lifestyle. You know, it was really wonderful. It was a great visit. Yeah.
I appreciate your talk, and I also appreciate you noting that for the Germans, especially the ones that I've become very, you know, over 30 years of having been an exchange student there, I'm still in contact with my host family, and the war actually still has a bigger impact, I think, on them than it does us. They still talk about it more and memorialize it more, I think, than we do. So I really appreciate your talk, kind of bringing it home to us here.
If I can make a comment, and I don't know how prevalent this is, but I got a sense from some that there was a reticence to recording, to documenting those stories. It took some doing to get the story, or to even, I haven't gotten it yet, but to find a willingness to get the story of the Luftwaffe pilot. I mean, it's changing perhaps, but hopefully not before these people have passed and their stories aren't recorded, because they're really important for all of us.
Yeah, it was a really, really painful time for a lot of people there. Yeah. Especially the period right after the war, when they were just completely devastated.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great.
I have a comment. One of the reasons that they went to indiscriminate bombing was, like on the Schweinfurt raid, they could have expected out of 1,000 bombs, maybe 5 to hit the factory under perfectly clear visibility in any of the bombing.
No. I mean, I don't want to disagree, but American daylight tactical bombing was very precise. I mean, they had misses, obviously. In fact, a bomb fell in Sennfeld that just, I don't know if it was that time, but generally speaking, the American idea was to preserve their crews and bomb with minimal effort with maximum effect. And so they used targeted bombing. That's why they sacrificed all these crews against daylight German fighters, which were vastly superior. The British were using the night bombing. That might be what you're referring to.
No, I'm not referring to that. You know, I know that they gave up really on the idea of hitting the target. And that's why under any kind of visibility conditions, they continued to bomb. For example, they couldn't see a lot of the cities that they were bombing because of, you know, overcast or whatever. And they went right ahead with that. And the reason, the way they justified it was that even though they're not going to be able to hit the factory, like in Schweinfurt or any other primary target, by destroying the city, they were able to cause serious damage to the war effort.
Yeah, I've heard that of the British night bombing, but not of the American bombing.
I heard it from my dad, who was in Schweinfurt, right? Oh. And yes, and I heard it during the Vietnam War era, and when a lot of people were being, really looked down on because of sort of the indiscriminate killings that were going on in Vietnam. And he said when they had bombs, that they hit anything they could hit, and that they flew over the target, they would hit anything to do to cause damage and to disrupt, and that they would never come back with a bomb. They would prefer, and they didn't really care what it was, as long as it would cause disruption.
Tony, I also studied in Germany, was an exchange student, and ultimately studied there as well, and have gone back virtually every other year over the last 50 years. And I just wanted to follow up on a previous speaker in terms of what I've seen as a distinct change in attitude about reviewing the war experience. And particularly in the last couple years, the kind of coverage of the closing of the war, particularly last year, the coverage and reporting about what took place in early 1945 as Allied troops were pushing from the west and what was happening to the east. It has been front page news on most of the newspapers, again, localized, people recalling experiences. Part of this renaissance is a reflection of the fact that the people who actually lived the era are quickly dying off, and a real desire by the third generation to understand a little more about what took place. The other thing that's noticeable are the number of dramas now that are covered or try to pick up the theme of the war era in Germany, something that was taboo for most of the last 30, 40 years. We have, since World War II, glamorized the combat experience with our war movies. We went through that again to a certain extent with the Vietnam War, something that was for the most part a taboo subject in German cinema up to maybe Das Boot, and there was another much earlier piece called The Devil's General, which had to deal with an effort, an assassination attempt on Hitler. But again, I think there's been a real change that way, and so I see your effort in a way as being a small contribution to that overall reconstruction of history.
Yeah, we're trying. It's not speaking German, somewhat hampered. I think we just have a couple more minutes, I think.
Just have you, first off, thanks for an excellent talk. It was very much appreciated here. And secondly, have you managed to make contact with the families of your dad's crew and share these stories with them?
With the family of ball turret gunner Boylan, with navigator Molly Dahl, with the bombardier Roberson, and with Michael Feller. But the others we haven't been able to find yet. But I figured, and with the internet, eventually should be able to strike gold on that one. And we still have pieces of the bomber that I'm saving to give to those families as a remembrance for them. So, if nothing else, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming out and sharing the story.
That was Tony Yorba in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded January 19, 2016 at 360 in Juneau, with support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman and Associates Incorporated, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.